Dann würde ich sagen, wir beginnen jetzt hiermit. Also, ja, herzlich willkommen zum Panel 11 des Kongresses Ästhetik und Erkenntnis der Deutschen Gesellschaft für Ästhetik. Es ist mir eine große Freude, dass ich hier heute dieses Panel moderieren darf. Es trägt den Titel Choreographien des Gefühls, Bedeutungen und Wahrnehmungserfahrungen im Tanz. Und unsere Referentinnen sind Renate Bräuninger, Einav Katan-Schmid und Katja Vaghi. Das Anliegen dieses Panels ist es, oder in dem Zentrum steht der Versuch, 3 Perspektiven von Verständigungsprozessen in der Tanzästhetik zu zeigen und vielleicht auch miteinander in den Diskurs zu bringen. Und der erste Vortrag stammt von Renate Bräuninger. Sie hat in München und New York an den Universitäten und an unterschiedlichen Tanzschulen studiert und hat an der Middlesex University in London ihre Doktorarbeit über musikalisch-choreografische Analysen und deren theoretische Konzepte verfasst und hat danach als Tanz- und Musikwissenschaftlerin an deutschen und englischen Universitäten unterrichtet, zuletzt als Senior Lecturer an der University of Northampton. Ihre Forschung beschäftigt sich mit musikalisch-choreografischer Analyse und Fragen der Notation, Archivierung und Prozessen der Bedeutungsfindung sowie der künstlerisch-wissenschaftlichen Forschung, die sie als Practice as Research bezeichnet. Ihr Vortrag trägt den Titel Die Ästhetik der Intensität zwischen Prozess und Rezeption. Renate Bräuninger, bitteschön.
Ja, vielen Dank für die Vorstellung. Ich versuche mal gerade meinen Bildschirm hier zu teilen. Okay. Und, oh, wo ist es jetzt? Mein PowerPoint. Die war gerade noch da. So, sehen Sie denn alle jetzt?
Ja.
Okay. Ups. Also, die Arbeit einiger zeitgenössischer Choreografinnen. Meine Beispiele sollen hier Anne-Theresa de Kersmaeker und Lemmy Bonifacius sein, erzeugt durch einen bestimmten formalen Aufbau, Intensität und eine affektive Resonanz, womit sie die repräsentative Qualität und semiotische Lesbarkeit von Tanz unterminiert. Das Erzeugen von Intensitäten als wesentliche Funktion kann auf verschiedene Weise erklärt werden. Zum einen entspricht es einem gewissen Lebensgefühl, das vor der Corona-Krise bestimmend war, einem Leben, das durch ein schneller und mehr von Eindrücken und Erfahrungen definiert ist. Dieses Lebensgefühl wird zum Beispiel in Tristan Garcias La Vie Intense von 2016 beschrieben. Zum anderen drückt es sich durch eine Art Sehnsucht nach Spiritualität aus, eine Art Rückkehr zu Archetypen, die wiederum nicht frei sind von einer Art Anspruch auf die Absolutheit von Kunst, die sich an der Perfektion und Absolutheit der Muster, die wir in der Natur finden, orientiert. Darüber hat Anne-Theresa de Kersmaeker am Collège de France 1919 einen Vortrag gehalten, den man auch noch auf der Website ihrer Kompanie Rosas sich anhören kann. Meine Beispiele zeigen, dass diese Herangehensweise an Choreografie nicht allein für den westlichen Theatertanz typisch ist, sondern auch im Tanz anderer Kulturen angewandt wird. Es fragt sich allerdings, ob in der Choreografie Lemmy Bonifacius das Verwenden bestimmter minimalistischer Dispositive des westlichen Theatermachens nicht eine Kritik an eben diesen ist und damit eine postkoloniale Dekonstruktion. Ich mache jetzt einen kurzen historischen Exkurs. In ihrer Entwicklung ist die Ästhetik des westlichen Theatertanzes durch die Dualität zwischen Repräsentation und Ausdruck von Emotionen bestimmt. In den besprochenen Beispielen des zeitgenössischen Tanzes, so möchte ich argumentieren, kollabieren diese beiden Ansätze im Erzeugen von Intensitäten. Das Ballett ist in erster Linie formell bestimmt und dient zur Repräsentation politischer Macht, sowohl in traditionellen Monarchien als auch in den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika. Ausdruck und Narrative werden durch kodifizierte Mimik und Gestik vermittelt. Der moderne Tanz hinterfragte diesen Ansatz in seinen Ursprungsländern, den USA und Deutschland, auf ähnliche und dennoch kulturell verschiedene Art und Weise. Es ist nicht mehr die äußere Form, sondern die innere Erfahrung von Emotionen, die zum Auslöser der Bewegung wird. Das auch am Beginn der Moderne, wo das Individuum sich selbst sucht. Im deutschen Ausdruckstanz liegt dem ein System der Bewegungsanalyse zugrunde, im amerikanischen ein dynamisches Prinzip, dynamische Prinzipien der Bewegungsgenerierung. In beiden Formen fand eine Verschiebung von Mustern und Gestaltschaften zu innerer Erfahrung hin statt. Deutsche Ausdruckstanz hat sich dann durch die Korruption, durch das Naziregime in Deutschland bis heute nur bedingt weiterentwickelt. Entwicklungen fanden eher in Großbritannien und den USA statt und haben dort wiederum Einfluss auf Europa gehabt. Daneben durch die vielfältige Immigration deutscher Tanzschaffender während des Naziregimes fanden auch starke Entwicklungen in Asien und in anderen Teilen der Welt statt. Die Entwicklung des amerikanischen Tanzes ist immer eine Geschichte der Rebellion, wo die sozusagen nachfolgende Generation wieder gegen die Elterngeneration rebelliert. Und so ist auch im postmodernen Tanz, obwohl diese Problematik, diese Terminologie hochproblematisch ist, aber das möchte ich jetzt nicht näher darauf eingehen, aber auch im postmodernen Tanz findet dann wieder eine Rückkehr zu Formalem statt. Und durch dieses Formale, durch formale Setzungen, findet hier wieder eine Rückkehr, durch formale Setzungen findet sozusagen auch wiederum eine Unterminierung von Repräsentation statt, nämlich indem ich Form von außen aufsetze. Das Stück ist 15 Minuten lang. Und das bestimmt dann einfach den Verlauf. Oder aber ich schaffe, bestimmte Systeme, nach denen Wiederholungen stattfinden muss, Kontrapunkt stattfindet und so weiter und so fort. Diese Parameter wurden, nachdem diese Phase der Rebellion aufgegeben wurden, dann zu Formkonzepten, die man sozusagen immer wieder als Handwerkszeug verwendet hat. Jetzt, wenn wir uns Fragen der Ästhetik zuwenden, dann kommt Tanz als Medium eine ganz bestimmte Rolle die auch durch die Art und Weise dadurch bestimmt wird, dass Tanz zum einen ein visuelles Medium ist und somit zugänglich für Theorien, die sich mit optischer Wahrnehmung auseinandersetzen, zum anderen aber auch durch somatische Empfindungen, durch kinästhetische Erfahrungen bestimmt wird und somit also für Theorien von affektiver Resonanz zugänglich sind. Es geht aber in der Theoriebildung nicht allein um die Wahrnehmung von Tanz, sondern auch um dessen Ausführung. Das war von Anfang an eigentlich recht bestimmend und auch um die Frage des Körperwissens, das Tanzschaffende brauchen. In diesem Zusammenhang ist innere Anschauung wichtig. Innere Anschauung ist auch ein Konzept, das immer wieder in der Philosophie auftaucht. Die Frage ist aber, ob zum Beispiel Konzepte, die wir bei Kant finden und so weiter, für Tanz nützlich sind, wenn es um die eigene Körpererfahrung geht und diese Fähigkeit, auch Bewegung im virtuellen und sensuellen vorzukonzipieren oder vorzuerfahren. Die Tanzwissenschaft kam auch relativ spät, wurde sie eine akademische Disziplin und hat sich eigentlich bei der Bildung eines Diskurses an allen anderen Fächern orientiert, und es gibt also trendige Aneignungen vom Textual Turn bis zum Process Turn. Und die zahlreichen Formen von Tanz als Text sind insofern problematisch und bleiben problematisch, die ab den 80er Jahren sehr viel ausmachen im Diskurs über Tanz, da sie dieses zentrale Problem der Vorsprachlichkeit und kinästhetischen Erfahrung, das sehr wichtig ist für das Verständnis des Tanzes, denen nicht gerecht werden. Die Dramaturgin, Performerin und Philosophin Bojana Červić, die auch die Dramaturgin von Anna-Theresa de Kersmaeker ist, hat in ihrer Dissertation Choreographing Problems Kritik an dieser Untertheoretisierung der Tanzwissenschaft geübt. Červić argumentiert, dass eines der Probleme der Theoriebildung im zeitgenössischen Tanz daher rührt, dass einige Pioniere der Tanzforschung sowohl Praktikerinnen als auch Theoretiker waren und deshalb immer beim Schreiben über Tanz von ihren persönlichen Erfahrungen beim Improvisieren hauptsächlich ausgegangen sind und dies zu ihrer theoretischen Grundlage nahmen, wobei dann die Theorie über Tanz ganz, ganz stark von der Phänomenologie bestimmt ist. So, jetzt hat man mir geraten, jetzt nicht nicht direkt die Video-Exempel hier anzuklicken, sondern auf sondern hier sehen Sie alle jetzt das Beispiel?
Ja.
Okay, und ich möchte jetzt mal vorab, bevor ich weiter darüber spreche, ein Beispiel von Lemmy Bonifatius von seinem Stück The Tempest zeigen, damit wir irgendwie wissen, über was wir hier eigentlich sprechen. Und dann mal kurz reinschauen. Ist der Ton da?
Ja. Aber
Ist abgehakt, Renate. Vielleicht schickst du den Link in der Chat.
ja, wenn Sie den Link in den Chat schicken, dann schauen wir uns das selber an, weil es abgehackt ist.
Okay.
Sie müssten nur den Link kopieren in der YouTube-Zeile und in den Chat stellen. Genau. Ah, der Lorenzo hat schon reingestellt.
Ach,
Schon
super.
Ja?
Ja, danke. Wollen Sie sich gleich anschauen, oder?
Wie lange sollten wir?
Schon, ich glaube, wir sollten das angucken, aber wie lange?
Also vielleicht so jedes, so kurz 2 Minuten reinschauen. Da gibt es auch noch einen zweiten von der Kersmaeker ab Minute 2:11. Da mal kurz reinschauen.
Aha, wir sollen jetzt in beide Videos reinschauen?
Ja, das wäre super.
Und dann das zweite Video ab 2:11? Und wie lange ins zweite Video?
Auch so 2 Minuten.
Okay, dann würde ich sagen, wir schauen uns das jetzt alle an und treffen uns dann wieder hier um 9:23 Uhr spätestens.
Oh ja.
Bei mir ist es 9:18 Uhr und um 9:23 Uhr geht es weiter.
Ja.
Ist das gut?
Ja, super.
Okay, prima, bis gleich.
Bis gleich.
So, ich wäre wieder da.
Ja, dann mache ich.
Mal. Ja.
Gut, dann mache ich weiter. Also zu dem Handwerkszeug, das aus dieser rebellischen Phase des frühen postmodernen Tanzes gewonnen wurden, gehören eben Repetition, Akkumulation, Fast-Shifting und verschiedene Formen der Zersplitterung narrativer und performativer Elemente. Die endlose Wiederkehr desselben, welches nicht das Gleiche ist, hinterfragt die Repräsentation, Entschuldigung, mit Deleuze, Zitat: Die Wiederholung besitzt also einen ursprünglichen Sinn aus der Perspektive der Repräsentation, den Sinn einer materiellen und nackten Wiederholung, einer Wiederholung desselben und nicht mehr nur unter demselben Begriff. Jeder weitere Sinn wird von diesem äußeren Modell abgeleitet. Das heißt, immer wenn wir auf eine Variante, eine Differenz, eine Verkleidung, eine Verschiebung stoßen, werden wir sagen, es handelt sich um Wiederholung. Allerdings nur auf abgeleitete analoge Art und Weise. Die Theologin, Zitat Ende, Theologin Catherine Pickstock verweist in ihrem Buch Repetition and Identity von 2013 darauf, differences seek constantly to escape the trap, or one might say creatively produce or constitute the trap, or ontologically represent of the ontological representational sphere into which local entities constitute by non-identical repetition of themselves inevitably fall, since any establishment or unity cannot escape capture by generality and the representational gaze. Das heißt also, durch Wiederkehr von immer wieder den gleichen Elementen, durch eine Art Zersplitterung, durch die ein fortlaufendes Narrativ oder eine Entwicklung von Bewegung als solche nicht möglich ist, durch so ein Spielen mit der Zeit, sehen wir eigentlich immer wieder das Gleiche, das nicht dasselbe ist, wodurch wir eigentlich von dem eigentlichen Sehen und Interpretieren der Elemente des Sehens abgelenkt werden. Gleichzeitig ist zum Beispiel bei Anna-Theresa de Kersmaeker die Choreografie so ein Prozess, der irgendwie losgelassen wird und nicht so eine bestimmte Form, die aufgeführt wird. Deshalb hier ein Zitat von Cevic und Kersmaeker. By suggesting that dance can be a form of conducting intensities hidden within a choreographic structure and then released from in, once the structure is like a machine set into accelerating motion, these performances reclaim the importance of living, both through the mechanic and organic characteristics. Unlike the rational technical mechanisms, the desire machine, here they are quoting Deleuze and Guattari, is here a principle of perpetual and differential productivity of movement that makes movement divorced from individual subjective bodies and circulate on a plane of functional and self-referential singular identities in a now which cuts and re-establishes itself over and over again. So, als würde dadurch so ein maschineller Prozess in Gang gesetzt werden, der auch den einzelnen Körper auslöscht und eigentlich so zu so einer übergreifenden Maschinerie der Intensitätsproduktion macht. Das Publikum kann also nicht mehr Bewegen und Gesten lesen, denn es sind immer wieder in einzelnen Momenten des Übergangs wird sozusagen aufgeweckt, und das ist so ein Mechanismus, wie Minimalismus auch kognitiv wirkt, dass wir irgendwann abschalten von dem, was wir sehen oder auch hören, auch in der Musik, und dann nur noch Einzelnes rauspicken, und letztendlich wirft es uns zurück auf so eine Art inneres Gefühl, dem Hier und Jetzt zu sein. Idealerweise. Und jetzt ist dann das große Problem, also ich habe sowohl das im Post-Performance-Gespräch von de Kersmaeker und dem Bonifacio erlebt, dass die Zuschauer natürlich sagen, okay, wie soll ich dieses und jenes Element interpretieren, worauf dann beide aufgeschrien haben und gesagt haben, ich will meine Choreografie nicht gelesen wissen. Das sind so Intensitäten, auf die man sich einlassen muss. Und es ist halt schwierig für Zuschauer oft, das zu tun und sich auf diese Emotionen, die da ausgelöst werden, einzulassen. Und das ist auch die Frage, inwieweit, also ich habe das bei verschiedenen Analysen, die ich versucht habe zu unternehmen, inwieweit ist es möglich, überhaupt so eine Lesbarkeit wirklich aus einer Performance rauszunehmen. Also jede Kultur, die eigentlich sprachbasiert sind wir auch so ein bisschen semiotisch trainiert, ob bewusst oder nicht, eben zu sagen, ja, was bedeutet jetzt der rote Schal oder die schwarzen Schuhe und so weiter. Und es ist auch interessant, dass de Kersmaeker, also in ihren zahllosen Veröffentlichungen, immer gern davon spricht, ich schreibe Choreografie, aber sie möchte dann nicht gelesen haben und spricht aber auch von dieser Ekritur-Choreographik und nimmt dieses Wort Choreograf, das ja auch ein Schreiber von Tanz ist, sehr wörtlich. Und die Frage ist nun, ob dieses Zurückwerfen auf so eine Art innere Empfindung und kinästhetische Empathie, die hier jetzt größer ist, also bei jedem Ballett haben die Leute mehr oder minder kinästhetische Empathie, woraus das herrührt. Und es ist garantiert so eine spirituelle Komponente damit eingebaut. Und jetzt ist natürlich die Frage, wenn ein Choreograf wie Lemmy Bonifacio, der in Neuseeland arbeitet und ursprünglich aus Samoa ist, was passiert jetzt, wenn der sich dieses europäische Handwerkszeug zulegt und wie man das in einem postkolonialen Kontext interpretieren kann. Und Guy Zimmermann interpretiert in seiner Analyse von Bonifatios Stück, wo ich auch den Ausschnitt gezeigt habe oder den Sie sich anschauen könntet, Tempest Without a Body von 2007, als eine Aneignung des europäischen Theatertexts, der in einem postkolonialen Kontext durchaus problematisch gesehen werden kann. Und die Frage ist jetzt nun, wenn Bonifatius aus so einem Text von Shakespeare, The Tempest, den man auch kritisch in einem postkolonialen Kontext lesen kann, was bedeutet das dann? Ist es dann dasselbe, wie wenn Kersmacher dieses Handwerkszeug anwendet? Oder kann man das auch leicht anders interpretieren? Zimmermann in seiner Interpretation geht zurück auf Lenz-Thies Lehmann, das posttraumatische Theater, wo dann so eine Wegentwicklung vom Text hin zum Spektakel stattfindet. Und das auch charakterisiert ist eben durch dieselben Stilmittel. Man kann sich bei Bonifacio auch fragen, da er eine tänzerische Ausbildung hat, wo er da wirklich herkommt. Und aber auch hier möchte ich jetzt kurz noch ein Zitat bringen. Versucht Bonifatius jetzt nicht so wie bei Kersmacher ist es so ein bisschen unklar, das ist so eine Mischung zwischen, dass man manchmal bei ihr das Gefühl hat, das ist so eine Zurückkehr zu New Age, auf der anderen Seite ist dieses Herausarbeiten, diese absoluten Muster, die sozusagen beinahe was Transzendentales haben, geht auch beinahe in diese Kategorie, das absolut in der Kunst, wie es im deutschen Idealismus zu finden ist. Aber niemand hat sich dazu mehr explizit geäußert. Bei Bonifatius kann man es jetzt so lesen, als würde er sagen, okay, durch den Kolonialismus hat so ein europäisches kapitalistisches Besitzdenken diese Spiritualität erstmal negiert. Und die ist verloren gegangen. So kann man die jetzt wieder zurückholen. Und jetzt hier Zitat, I'm trying to find your thoughts, Bonifacio says, to find the image of the world you have, to get your pre-thoughts. Through pre-thoughts, Bonifacio refers to affective states which in Deleuzian terms can be viewed as an intensely charged presubjective material out of which thoughts and identities arise. Affect is a terrain at which sorceries, capitalists and animists aim their resources. Bonifatius' work thus exemplifies the political thrust of the post-traumatic, suggesting how the visual spectacle of Wilson and Castellucci also seek to shift the political away from the Enlightenment rationalism back towards the affective ground of aesthetic practice in new forms of activism. Also so eine Art politische Interpretation nun an diesem auf Sensuelle zurückwerfen. Und es passiert jetzt auch was ganz Eigenartiges, weshalb ich aber das Bonifacio-Stück spreche, und das ist so beinahe mein vorletzter Satz, ist, dass ich es mir eigentlich auch angeschaut habe und mich dann selten irgendwie so gelangweilt habe während eines Stückes und dann dachte, was mache ich hier? Und als dann der Vorhang ging und ich aufstande, dann habe ich so ein Gefühl von innerer Transformation gehabt, dass ich gedacht habe, okay, das ist es. Und das ist jetzt nun die Frage, wie findet man ästhetische Kriterien für diese Art von Affektgeneration oder auch ein Zurückbringen, so ein mindful Achtsamkeit Zurückbringen des Zuschauers, das also jenseits von so einer Semiotik funktioniert und das meiner Meinung nach sehr untertheoretisiert ist, und das ist jetzt auch von mir nur eigentlich so ein erster Versuch, das anzusprechen. Ja.
So, wunderbar. Haben Sie herzlichen Dank für diesen wunderbaren Vortrag. Leider gibt es hier die Klatschfunktion nicht. Das Einzige, was ich inzwischen rausgefunden habe, ist, aber das geht auch nicht so schnell, man könnte in den Chat klatschen. Okay, gut, also stellen Sie sich uns Klatschen vor und mein Video muss ich auch wieder ausmachen. Okay, herzlichen Dank, Frau Bräuninger, für Ihren Vortrag zur Information für die anderen Teilnehmerinnen. Wir haben vereinbart, dass wir alle Vorträge nacheinander machen und am Schluss die Diskussion, um in der Zeit zu bleiben. Sollte es jetzt dringende Nachfragen an Frau Bräuninger geben, können Sie das aber natürlich auch jetzt schon machen. Ansonsten würde ich Sie bitten, dass Sie sich Ihre Fragen notieren und wir die dann gemeinsam am Schluss besprechen. Und noch eine andere wichtige Information: Es handelt sich hier um ein zweisprachiges Panel. Wir haben nämlich 2 Teilnehmerinnen, die nicht Muttersprachlerinnen sind, aber sehr gut Deutsch verstehen, aber natürlich nicht so gerne in Deutsch einen wissenschaftlichen Vortrag unbedingt halten möchten. Deswegen verstehen Sie alles, was ich sage, aber der Höflichkeit halber switche ich jetzt auch ins Englische und übergebe dann an die beiden Referentinnen. Und genau, so springen wir dann am Schluss auch in der Diskussion zwischen den Sprachen wieder hin und her. Gut, dann kommen wir jetzt zum zweiten Vortrag. Our second speaker is Einav Katan-Schmid, and her lecture has the title, actually the German title, Berührende Formen des Tanzes. I have written here, it's so touching forms of dance, I guess. Yeah. Dr. Einav Katan-Schmid is a core convener for the International Network Performance Philosophy and a member of the editorial board of Studies in Dance, Theories and Practices, a Dance Studies Association and Michigan University Press, where it's published. She led the practice-based research project Playing with Virtual Realities as part of her postdoctoral fellowship at the Cluster of Excellence and Interdisciplinary Laboratory at Humboldt University, Berlin. In her research and teaching, she deals with methods of practice-based research, transmedia, and dance aesthetics from hermeneutical, phenomenological, and pragmatist perspectives. Among her publications is the book Embodied Philosophy in Dance, Gaga and Ohad Naharin Movement Research, which has been published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016. And her current research deals with choreography and choreographing. Her current research deals with choreographing the ethics of care in Israel. She holds a PhD in philosophy from Tel Aviv University and will start in October 2021, so this October, as the head of the dance school at Kibbutzim College for Education, Technology and Arts, as well in Tel Aviv, Israel. So, Einav, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Again, a technical break. Share files, here it is. Just a second. And here I am. So I decided to start, first of all, I'm putting myself also the timer. Just a second. And I decided to start with situating my research. So just to give you here my philosophical parents and where I am in this research. So I'm dealing with phenomenological and pragmatist perspectives in aesthetics, and of course Susan Lenger, John Dewey and Merleau-Ponty as few of the parents here, mainly because when I'm talking about definitions like aesthetic experience and so on, that you will know where I'm coming from. Also the relationship between feeling and a form, symbolic form, and of course, understanding through sensual experience. Okay, yeah, here it is. So touching contemplation, beyond dichotomies of body and mind. These presentations foster touch as a contemplative aesthetic sense. As the aesthetician, feminist, and philosopher of emotions, Caroline Korsmeyer, who claims for the aesthetic experience through touch, taste, and smell in the fine arts, has already argued, traditionally the distant or intellectual senses of vision and hearing are accepted as more relevant for aesthetic appreciation than the proximal bodily senses of smell, taste, and touch. She writes, the distant senses are standardly granted superiority on epistemic, moral, and aesthetic grounds. Epistemic because they direct attention from ourselves, taking and communicating information about the world around us. Moral because their freedom from appetite and sensation renders them unlikely to foster vice such gluttony or conceptions strictly overlooking voyeurism here, and aesthetic because the pleasure they afford are not mere essentially physical satisfactions. Nevertheless, despite the long tradition of neglecting the role of sensual bodily experience within aesthetic appreciation, the sensory term in aesthetics is not entirely new, and that's the reason I also brought Susan Langer here and John Dewey and also Merleau-Ponty, of course. However, the research on touch as a conveyor of meaning in dance aesthetic, an art form that relies on the interpretation of touch, is still underdeveloped. Here, I would like to contribute the discussion by understanding the aesthetic experience of bodily movement through the appreciation of touch from a composite position of a dancer and an audience member. For this purpose, my explanation will follow the informative appreciation that touching feelings provoke in respect to cultural forms as well as to personal experiences. By that, I foster a joint aesthetic appreciation of personally perceived affects and of symbolic forms in dance. In addition, touch, as I will argue, analyze, and explain here, is essential performative activity of extending intimate intersubjective understanding. By this, I would like to walk in the path Korsmeyer has implied and to interconnect epistemology, aesthetics, and ethics. I will do it through 3 case studies of Israeli choreographers in which touching feeling choreographies in which touching feelings are symbolic aesthetic content. And these are also contemporary female Israeli choreographers who work nowadays in the field and very major in the Israeli independent dancing. Situating this research in Israel, my motivating questions are what the aesthetic experience of touch can teach us while facing social realities with rifts and with seemingly contradicting trauma as within the Israeli society. How to start being in touch with a foresight, I'm using the sight here, or visions of a future in common. My attempt is not to answer these questions today, but rather to consider them for further research. So step 1, I'm dealing with epistemology right now. Touching epistemology, unfolding the perceptual experience of touch. And now the body. By Anat Danieli. And now the body is a choreography by Anat Danieli, the founder and the former artistic director of Kelim Center of Choreography in Bat Yam. The work was created together with Omer Uziel, a dancer and a physiotherapist. It composed from 2 parts. The first part is the treatment. As you see, he's physically treating her in the left picture. And the second part, the dance. In the first part, Danieli and Uziel are physically treating one another, moving into the flesh and the physical form of one another. In the second part, they compose the movement material from the first part as a ceremonial offer for the viewers. In the first part, Danieli and Uziel seem to refuse taking a performative role. When Danieli enters the stage, she even wears a blonde wig and a skirt and high heels. She undresses from these gender symbols and gives her body to her partner, while he gives himself back. Both seem to be oblivious to the presence of the audience. In their duet, it is hard to realize who is taking the leading part, who is the caretaker, and who is being treated. Each body part which touches another is both giving and receiving information. Their massages, the act of actually taking care of one another, is their symbolic offer to the audience. Daniele writes about the work. The body is the comfortable, natural, familiar, and comforting place for me. Movement is the anchor, the pleasure, the railing on which one can lean on when stability is needed. In fact, in my biography, dance has always have been a place of healing. But in previous works, it was placed deep between the folds of the work, whereas here it is laid out, exposed, and declared on the surface. And now the body, because in the body, emotional processes take place. Processes of healing and learning that cannot exist outside of the physical body. The body is the site for emotional work, even nowadays when culture is moving away from it to the digital sphere, as we are here right now. The call for physical presence is a call to return to what has no substitute in other domains. It is a call for feeling, for humanity, for empathy, and for touch. In this work, Daniele questions the relationship between her own body and as an artist and its social role. She undresses herself not just symbolically, but in order to challenge her own sensations on their immediate unarticulated information within the dance. In an interview with Daniele, she describes the body as an archive that holds all the data of trauma and pain, which is articulated as bodily tension and as pain within the muscles. In actuality, when they are dancing the treatment, Daniele and Uziel touch the pain in order to recognize, release, and reform it, like in a treatment. So what do we touch? I will read here from Touching Feelings by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, also feminist queer theorist. Even more immediately than other perceptual systems, it seems the sense of touch makes nonsense out of any dualistic understanding of agency and passivity. To touch is always already to reach out, to fondle, to heft, to tap, or to enfold, and always also to understand other people or natural forces as having effectively done so before oneself, if only in the making of a textured object. So when we are touching something, we are already in an act of doing and also comprehending the doing throughout history. So what do we touch when we touch the body? As Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick stresses it, we touch our feelings. But feelings are not just sensations. They are also affects, first and foremost also affects. The most obvious feeling is the relationship between touch and sexual desire. I wanted to say textual desire, but sexual desire. However, for both Daniele and Sedgwick, sexual desire is hardly the issue. Sedgwick mentions the inner relationship between touch and shame, for example. Awareness to touch confronts us with self-image and with our personal history and with cultural values that contradict them. As Daniele mentions it as well, it is where trauma is articulated as an actual pain, both physical and emotional. To touch is to undergo this pain in order to let it be in movement. By moving, healing happens. So what do we touch? We touch knowledge from the past articulated as present feeling. Step 2, aesthetics, contemplating an experience. So Simple Action is a work by Yasmin Goder, maybe one of the most interesting contemporary voices in Israeli choreography, and one of the leading of them. So imagine, you enter the theater from the actor's entrance. You are sitting on a chair in a circle with the other audience members. The dancers sit in between you. There is no clear division between you and them. Tomer Damsky, the musician, is playing. This dance is once again, like the offer of Danieli, a ceremonial environment. A dancer stands up, he is coming towards your neighbor, sends his hand, invite her to lean on him, and then he brings her down to the floor. Another dancer reaches your partner and hug him. You know, his mom has just passed away. You see how he unlooses the bodily tension you haven't realized until now that he is constantly holding. You are being moved. Another dancer approaches you. She takes you down to the floor. Then she asks you to go and support another audience member. This time, you offer a hand to someone else you don't know. They lean on you, you feel their weight, and carefully take them down. Sit next to them and go back to your seat. Then you realize you are in a ceremony of people offering care and release. However, these people don't go home with you. It is still an aesthetic environment, a framework, and a symbolic proposition for society where the act of caring is choreographed and manifested. In addition, in this dance, the audience is not a viewer. It is not merely our eyes we are using for appreciating the experience. We are experiencers. We touch, we take part, we participate, and we are active in feeling the responsibility for one another and for this aesthetic event. I am active in comprehending the hidden unspoken experiences that other people undergo next to me. When I let them lean on me or see them taken care of by others. So how do we touch? For Richard Kearney, touch is the most holistic and synesthetic of the senses. It is logically the primal mode of sensibility in both life, meaning survival, and love, meaning value. All tall order for the body, forever on double duty. Also, we can never avoid touch. While we can close our eyes, our ears, our nostrils, and our lips, we are always touching and being touched. And touch is a membrane, I'm quoting now, sensitive to what is not itself. A portal opening onto a world that can never be shut. It is the first sight of our consent to being and our welcome to others. Being in touch means being at risk, being between suffering and joy. And without risk, no life worth living. So again, no life worth living, going here back to value. In Simple Action, risk and intimacy are framed within the action of taking care. In it, the sensation of touching the others is not there for the sake of our own sensual pleasure. It is already interlocked within the responsibility for them and the attempt to comprehend what they might experience. As we are touching them perceiving their weight, and by this, sensually, we are undergoing their feelings. Touch is a participatory sense. Goder uses choreography that breaks the fourth wall and puts the viewer in the responsible, I cannot call it viewer anymore, experiencer, in the responsible role of a sensitive sensor who is called for action. Through participatory touch, she invites us to experience the acknowledgement of risk, intimacy, and consent as practical as well as symbolic values, aesthetic values. Susan K. Langer points out in Feeling and Form that in dance, the illusion is something that is created at first touch or motion. For Langer, this claim lies at the core of her theory concerning the living transition of meaning that aesthetic symbols convey. Accordingly, concrete physicality and abstract ideas are not a negation or a dichotomy. For Langer, it is crucial for dance that what is shown equals what is there. The appearance is a direct result of artistic actuality. She quotes Frank Thies's remarks on a ballerina who performs a grand jeté. The body is supposed to appear weightless, and thus, from artistic point of view, to be so. In Yasmin Goder's Simple Action, the integration of meaning and action is manifested through the aesthetic experience of being in touch with one another. It's both a symbol of being proposition, symbolic proposition of being in touch with one another, and an actual activity. The symbolic act of forming a society of care is actually performed by everyone in the room. Furthermore, by supporting each other and by comprehending experiences through human touch, the dance invites us to contemplate risk and intimacy as both qualities and values of being in human society. So how do we touch? We are feeling and forming an experience, which means we are both perceiving and contemplating, sensing and comprehending, feeling and forming. Step 3, moral processes of reasoning. We are in the ethical section. Touching intersubjective witnessing. Rescue is a work by Dana Yahalomi for the performance group she leads, Public Movement. As taken from Public Movement website, this choreography, the choreography of rescue, is extrication is an extension of useful and familiar movements that are usually practiced in sites of mass casualty by the rescue teams. Disconnected from threat or trauma, the carefully synchronized set of movements evoke a sense of togetherness that binds passerby and performers somewhere between danger and compassion. I watched the performance of Rescue in the parking of the hospital Bikur Cholim in Jerusalem. This is the oldest hospital in the country which is still operating. Bikur Cholim is also a very known hospital because its location in downtown Jerusalem has proven critical in times of emergency. With Jerusalem's other hospitals are located far away from the center, Bikur Cholim was able to save the lives of many victims of terrorist attacks. It's really known for this. Rescue is a durational performance, 4.5 hours, in the public sphere. As in other works of Public Movement, the dancers wear white uniforms. They start with what seems as a military parade, formation that puts their actions in a formality. Then they find their places in between stone ruins and gravels. You can see the gravels on the ground there. Within the ceremony, the dancers carry each other from the ruins into safety. The effort is transparent and it's immediate. They carry each other over and over again, dealing with weight, recognizing their bodies, negotiating their effort, the dangerous surface, and the safety of their partners. Their white uniforms are getting dirty, as well as their skin. They sweat in Jerusalem's winter sun. The gravels are stuck to their skin and their flesh. In all these actions, they perform full concentration. Their mission is immediate, right here, right now. As in Goder's Simple Action, also in Dana Yahalomi's Rescue, the dancer's appearance is not merely a symbol of compassion, but rather a direct expression of the execution of it. They have to take care not only for others, but also for themselves. They have to regulate their effort and to take care not to harm themselves while rescuing the others. I lived in Tel Aviv between 1996 and 2002, years when explosions in buses and restaurants were frequent. I experienced the war in Israel 2 months ago while I was visiting there. War is horrifying on many levels, and I cannot unfold here all the levels of horrifying aspects within a war. It is the opposition of sensitive negotiation and of care. And mostly it captures the imagination, and that's part of it. While being under threat of a concrete danger, it is very difficult to open up perspective and to look at others and the experience of others. Visions of horror are multiplied by the media, and the trauma is repeated over again rather than handled, analyzed, and treated carefully. We fear the horror and defend ourselves by limiting our perspectives to the sole angle of ourselves, our homes, or nations. We are protecting ourselves by limiting the scope of attention and distancing ourselves from the other. In practice, as rescue revealed to me, through its performative act, scenes of horror, the actual scenes of horror, not those that multiplied by the media, are surfaces where care is practiced. When we see someone wounded, the gut instinct is to act. The body is a site for empathy. As Edmund Husserl already designated it, in empathy and the constitution of the other, sharing a physical existence generates empathy and intersubjective understanding. When we see someone at risk, beyond judgment, we act. While ideology feeds our imagination with visions of horror, the practice of touching the horror reinforms and recalls humanity. So why do we touch? Richard Kearney deals in touch with the image of the wounded healer. The wounded healer is the one who can bear witness to the suffering of others because he knows the suffering, so he is not rejected by it. He portrays the wounded healer through the image of Chiron from Homer's Odyssey, half man and half horse. I'm quoting from here. Chiron was mortally injured by Heracles during a boar hunt when a poisoned arrow struck his leg. Though Chiron could not cure his own wound, he found that he could cure others and became known as a wise and compassionate healer. I'm still there, sorry. Pain speaking to pain. Those who visited him in his subterranean cave felt more whole and well in his injured presence. This is from Richard Kearney's Touch. For Kearney, touch is an informed sense through experience. It is the experience of pain which helps us to overcome fear and let the touch go throughout the risky parts into movement, intimacy with the pain of others, and healing. So why do we touch? We touch for the sake of being within time, with the other, in care, with care. For being connected with the situation at hand and for attuning our imagination with the actual process that we are participating in it, and for mutual healing. Choreographies of touch in contemporary Israeli dance reminds us, Israeli audience, the necessary labor of witnessing others while getting familiar with our own pain and trauma. These dances manifest that to remain open-minded is an act which must go through the senses. As Kearney reminds our digital culture, in a healthy life that the reversibility of sense presupposes the omnipresence of universal tactility. Without the transversality of touch, sensibility risks sensationalism. Sense without sensibility, perception without empathy, stimulation without responsibility. The labor of touch, the labor of being in touch, being responsible for ourselves, for others, with ourselves and others, is conditional for dealing with our presence within time, on our trauma and fears, and on the trauma and the fears of others. Being at risk, vulnerable, and open to the environment, but also open up for movement, change, and mostly healing. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. I hope you can see and hear us clapping. Thank you very much, Einav, for this wonderful, very touching presentation, I have to say. And yeah, if there are no really urgent questions, I'm looking in the round, but I don't see them. So as I explained before, we are collecting the questions for the discussion afterwards. And yeah, your presentation, of course, also reminded me of the key lecture we had yesterday by Mieke Baal, where she also spoke very touchingly about empathy. And now we are coming to that's my bridge for the next presentation and the last for today for this panel. And this is the presentation by Katja Vaghi with the German title as well, Tanz lokalisieren, Tanz und Deixis. And Katja Vaghi is a Swiss dancer, choreographer, somatic technique teacher, and dance researcher who alternates theoretical reflections in written form to practical musing in the rehearsal space. She holds a PhD in dance philosophy from the University of Roehampton and is lecturing at Die Etage School for Performance and Visual Arts in Berlin and at the Rampart School for Ballet and Contemporary Dance in London, as well as the University of Roehampton and somatic approaches to space at the University of Sciences and Arts in Coburg. Her research interests are reference practices and intermediality, the comic in dance, screen dance, and embodiment in spatial perception. And as far as I know, she also will refer to Mieke Baal probably in her presentation. So, Katja, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. And I was really impressed by, actually, there is a very nice direct thread between our interventions. So I'm really pleased about that. So what I'm doing here might be a bit experimental. I somehow postponed writing these papers as I knew I was going to present my idea to a different kind of audience than when I usually do at dance studies conferences. And I'm glad to have waited, as the introductory remarks to this conference and the keynotes gave me a nudge on the direction to take. And so I made this paper more discursive instead of a canned intervention that has been prepared beforehand and has not a clear connection to the other talks or text presented. And here I have a footnote, which makes me think that far too often we forget that research is also an exchange between embodied individuals and not simply an interaction between the embodied researcher at their desk and a pile of text of somehow disembodied authors. Intertextuality and intermediality is something that is close to my heart as the topic of my PhD research. So I have the tendency of wanting to set text in intertextual and intermediate relation. Unfortunately, there was no time for producing an intermediate response, but I found another way of doing this. I have to stitch part of the theory to make space for personal reflection and a little exercise that may bring you back to your lived body and allow me to pierce this screen or screens that divide us. My background, very shortly, is in dance practice, in ballet, in modern dance, Limon and Horton techniques, and later I did also contemporary dance. But I have also studied literature and linguistics before moving to dance studies. So I have experience in different fields with the different discourses. What I'm offering here are some preliminary thoughts and responses to what I heard in the opening of this conference that will flow into the introduction to a paper that I wrote some years ago and that won an award for the best postgraduate article offered by the Society of Dance History Research. Of course, this was just dance, so I'm welcoming now input from other disciplines. The occasion of this interdisciplinary conference allowed me to expand on the topic starting from a broader point of view, so to be able to reach a broader audience outside dance studies, but also coming from an Anglo-American background, even though I'm Swiss, I am aware of talking partly from a different philosophical tradition. I hope of making this accessible to all, but I think so. As a dance researcher, moving back and forth between theory and practice, even though I consider myself much more a theoretician, I'm trying to apply the knowledge that I have gathered through dance to other fields. At present, I'm also teaching architects and interior designer at the University of Applied Arts, Science and Arts in Coburg, for example. Derma module are a balanced unit of theoretical inputs, practical sensorial experiences, so exercises, and exchanges around on the practical experiences, so discussions. What I have noticed often is that exercises that for me are not so interesting produce a wild amazement in my colleagues and students. This point, at least for me, to dance as yet an unexplored resource for knowledge for other fields. That, of course, as a dance researcher, I want to explore further. And here I conclude my biographical part to move to my reaction to the welcoming introductory words by Professor Mersch and the thought-provoking keynotes by Professor Vaghi. Hearing the words, an image come to my mind, an intuition. As a dance researcher, I have felt I'm starting in a way from the other, silent end of knowledge, and that of the lived body, and try to verbalize what cannot be verbalized. The lived experience always preceding my attempts to put it into words. The words, on the other hand, started from reflection on art, trying to reach and connect back to the lived body. In a way, this reminded me of the mind-body dichotomy. As dancer and dance researcher, I have the feeling our advantage is to start from the body and move back to the mind or cognition. The intuitive image that came to my mind, that of a vividly colored body experience that I was forced through a large grey tunnel to emerge into intellectual reasoning words, is just an example. Please also mind my use of feel and feeling as pointing to intuitive knowledge. But here I'm moving on a terrain that is new to me, intuition, or the phenomena of my mind talking to me in images that I then translate into words, which are limited because I'm leaving, for example, the color that this image gave me out, that I feel unequipped at this point to discuss, and I move to the part that has been actually written beforehand for this conference. Some more thought on the connection to Baal use of trauma and somatics are in the conclusion of this paper. On the living body, perception and aesthetics. As we already seen, there are several ways in which to consider dance. The one I'm considering here tries to reconcile linguistic and the lived body in approaching dance practice through the linguistic notion of the ixis. I'm concentrating here more on the experience of the viewer, but of course the dancer and the practitioner can be also included. And maybe I shouldn't say viewer, but the experiences, as Einav said. At the beginning of her book, Embodied Philosophy in Dance, Ania Katan-Schmid explained very well that dance is not, and I'm quoting here, just a matter of form and composition, but rather should be seen as the living process of their shaping, end quote. Through bodies, through bodies in space and time. She clearly defines, quote, the communicative act of dancing as a perceptual process, end quote, that as a consequence can be expressive. Several are the sensory channels through which dance can be perceived, and one can move between the several senses while viewing or experiencing the dance. Vision and hearing are probably the one commonly associated to dance. There are nevertheless others more mysterious senses in the sense that they are central to everybody's life, but because they are so central, they are overseen, that are now currently being researched in dance, and these are connected to the lived body. In my paper, I argue, following Barbara Montero, 2006, Katan-Schmid, 2016, Richard Schusterman, 2008, and others, but also Mieke Paal, 1999, but not in relation to dance though here, that when discussing dance, it is important to consider proprioception as an aesthetic sense, together with vision and hearing. In adding proprioception, Montero explained, quote, the aesthetic value of dance partly deepens, end quote, where no sense, so no sensory senses, works by itself, but is rather fluid, organic movement from one to the other. This in relation to the dancer, but also the viewer or the perceiver. If vision and hearing focus being excluded from aesthetic as an intimate sense, Several internal senses can be distinguished, such as proprioception, relative, and this is my definition, to where my limbs are positioned in space in relation to gravity, but also kinesthetic, relative to how my body moves in space. Richard Schusterman position expands Montero's when he argues that proprioceptions, so plural, should be considered at the apex of soma-aesthetic perceptions. I want to concentrate though on proprioception only. In her argument, in sustain of proprioception as an aesthetic sense, Montero points also to the fact that, start quote, proprioception is not merely sensory, but represent object in the word, end quote. Of course, while watching a dance, for those audience members trained in dance, the experience will be more intense. Still, also those not trained will experience aesthetic through proprioception. But Montero goes beyond this when she remarks that being partially dependent on tactile experience, and here I'm connecting to what Ania said, and vision, proprioception can also be applied to art form where no direct movement is involved. For example, feeling the curvature of a statue or a painting by imaging our hands tracing the lines or following the forms. And here I move on to the ixis and the paper proper. The ixis is for me one element that composes proprioception. On the ixis. The creation of meaning in theatrical dance has always been of great interest to both dance scholars and practitioners. And I'm thinking here of Carroll and Baines, 99, Susan Foster, 86, 2008, Janet Hadsett, 88, Hadsett Lansdale, 99, 2007. Among the various models used to understand the process that the audience undergoes are theory based on language, and here I'm connecting to what Renate says. Textuality in particular, and in particular language relation to constant played an important role in the 80s and 90s in dance research. And I'm referring here to Susan Foster, 86, Mark Franco, 93, Gollner and Murphy, 95. The subsequent growing preoccupation in dance with focusing only on the audience intellect rather than on the individual bodily experience led to a push for the reintroduction of body, those of the dancer and performer, choreographers and audience member into research. Still, despite the important insight gained by both theoretical direction, these two apparently diverging framework have yet to merge. I argue that by using linguistic deixis theory that see language as embodied and context dependent, and here I have a list of linguists that are sustaining this. It is possible to begin the analysis of dance work more directly, starting from the living, from bodily experience. I base my argument on Mieke Baal application of the ixis to contemporary art. And this is Baal 99, quoting Caravaggio, contemporary art for Pestro's history. A way of overcoming the challenges contemporary art present to traditional interpretation, the ixis enable the semiotic approach to expand beyond the page and move into the somatic. As the artwork or theoretical object enters into dialogue with the audience, analysis of the deictic elements bring the experience of the sensual body back into art. What is the ixis? The ixis is a branch of pragmatics from the Greek word standing for 2 point. It points to the context in which a communication takes place. Consider a universal phenomenon, and first analyzed by Carl Bühler, 1934, it is considered by some to be the principal element of language, receiving a fair amount of academic interest throughout the year. I have a list of linguists that have sustained this. In this model of communication, the speaker is at the origo of an egocentric deictic field, Zeigfeld, so a field around us, from which space and time originate. The ixis does stand for a mental space to which the speaker and listener relate in order to decode the meaning of an utterance or written sentence. Language is thus guided by the speaker contextual embodied experience, with meaning seen as relational. Even though, for example, there are some linguists that argue that language is embodied and not. There are certain elements that are embodied in certain work. As Levinson does, I differentiate the X's from Peirce's very similar notion of index by considering the X's as the, and I start quote, the narrower linguistically relevant aspect of indexicality. Of the several categories distinguished, up to 8, but more generally 5, 3 of the three are particularly relevant to dance in terms of enabling the audience orientation in a dance work. And these are space, time, and persona. This will be more clear through an example. And the example is, and then he took it over there. Should we overhear this sentence, it is very unlikely that we will make sense of it. Meaning is formed through the sense of the words, the semantics, but also through their anchoring in the context. In this case, somebody, a male, a third person that is not involved in the discussion between the speaker and listener, has taken something somewhere at a particular time. This could mean, for example, and after having baked, Paul, my nephew, took the cake over to the counter. But another possible version could be, and after having packed, the pilot took his bag to the flight counter reserved to the airport staff. Without being able to access the speaker and listener mental space, we miss the information anchoring the sentence in a specific time and space and highlighting the relation between subject and object. More generally, the deictic approach entails the shift from a conception of language as a, and I quote here Levinson, generative system for objectively describing the world, end quote, and, start quote, a disembodied representational system, this is also Levinson, end quote, to one that locates meaning, start quote, in bodies rather than in mental processing abilities, end quote. And this was Maridu, with language envisioned as a hybrid merging of the deictic and the symbolic field. Thus, the X's is not just an early stage in the ontogenesis of children's language, but the core upon which the symbolic field is instated. This same aspect, space, time, and persona, I argue, are involved in the understanding and appreciation of dance. And here I'm moving away from linguistic. The advantage of the deictic approach is the focus is places on the audience or the experience of categories central to meaning making. And maybe we can argue about what is this meaning making. By working with this category, principle to embodiment, is it possible to argue that the X's allow the access to most basic experience of dance, helping to define how atmosphere is created and how conceptual and emotional responses are transmitted. At this point, instead of going through examples of categories with a dance, I would take these last 5 minutes for an exercise that will hopefully would illustrate them and at the same time make you aware of the different level of consciousness as in Merleau-Ponty expanded by Schusterman that are involved into the proprioceptive sense, of which I argue the X's is part. I take the example of Schusterman's, that Schusterman's give, which is also the smallest movement we can do. Throughout this paper, you have been breathing, but you barely notice it. You did not feel like gaping for air, I hope. This is the fourth level of consciousness. Now that I have made you attentive, you may have noticed the fact that you're breathing. This is the second level. If you now inquire a bit deeper, you may notice that you are breathing slower or faster than normal. So maybe you want to take a moment here. You are now explicitly aware of proprioception, of the perception. In the first level, there is a degree of self-reflection. You may want to close your eyes here and consider the effect of your own observation of the breath if it changes your breath. Maybe you're a bit anxious because you're observing the breath, so it gets a bit faster. When in front of an artwork, and in particular a live dance, we dance between this different level of consciousness. You can open your eyes. Going back to the isthmus and its category. So during this exercise, when I started addressing you, you have felt directly addressed and entering maybe in a sort of dialogue. Somebody switched on also the camera. If you compare to the rest of the paper where I basically wasn't addressing you, I was just talking to this question. This is the category of persona. During the breathing, if you really paid attention to it, you may have experienced it grounding in the here and now. And this is, of course, time. And possibly, maybe you also felt your sit bones, or you can feel now the sit bones on the surface you're sitting, the space in which you are at, and the space your body is occupying. And here I come to the conclusion. With this short example, I wanted to point out the importance of the relation between the work and the position of the audience or the experiencer in its bodily experience. Time, space, and persona are the most basic coordinate through which the audience member orient themselves in the work. Viewing a dance work is thus entering into a dialogue with it through a deictic process. At the beginning of the piece, there is an orientation phase, and then maybe you stay stuck in one of in a state, guided by the deictic categories that mediates between the reality created in the dance and the reality of the viewer. From the shared knowledge, where the dialogue starts, a shared realm is created in which understanding takes place, and that allows empathy to arise. In a time when a new technology are entering more and more our everyday life, on which we are more and more depending, it is imperative to consider the body and how we perceive the world beyond the visual. As Schusterman points out, quote, any use of new tools and technology involve new uses of the body, which mean new possibility of somatic strains, discomfort, but also some positive things, and it goes on, end quote. Possibly this period in which we were shut off from direct interaction has made us more aware of the importance of our embodied experience of reality, and also the intimate senses such as proprioception and touch, as Einav was mentioning. Going back to Professor Ball's intervention and connecting to her inquiry on the body and trauma, hopefully the body you have experienced through your breathing is not the traumatized body. I really hope that. But a body in a state of relative sensory pleasure. I hope you are in a space. Often we become aware of our bodies when these are in pain. Functional blending out or habits erase the senses or sensing from our awareness, or our bodies from our awareness when they function well. I call here to give our bodies time and attention also when they are functioning well and are in pleasure, and maybe so prevent a trauma to occur. But this is something like a very big hope, and I thank you for your attention.
I like this gesture of applauding on the screen very much, as we don't have this button to click. So thank you, Katja, also very much for your interesting presentation and the exercise, which brings us in the present moment back here. I'm wondering if there are some questions from the audience already. I also would have some, but I would also give the audience the word first. If they want to, I just wanted to explain again that we are having a bilingual panel, and I'm sitting at the ZHDK. I hope it's not too loud at the moment. It might go away immediately again, the noise. It's mostly just quick, short disturbances. So yeah, we're having a bilingual panel, and the audience is invited to ask also in German. You don't have to ask in English, you can write it to the chat. I also can translate if you would like that, so just don't feel afraid in any way. Unsere Teilnehmerinnen verstehen auch alle Deutsch, sie können also gerne ihre Fragen auch auf Deutsch stellen. Prima. Gut, dann würde ich gerne ausgehend von auch dieser Übung mit dem Atem, der ja auch wirklich eine Achtsamkeitsübung ist und uns wirklich ganz in den Moment zurückbringt, gerne nochmal zurückgehen zu dem Vortrag auch von Renate Bräuninger, weil Sie sagten so am Schluss ganz beiläufig, dass Sie diese Aufführungen von Bonifacio sich angesehen hatten und sich zu Tode langweilten, aber als Sie aufstanden, hatte eine Transformation stattgefunden. Und Sie haben aber dann gar nicht so richtig was über diese Transformation gesagt, was vielleicht ja auch sehr schwer ist zu sagen. Ich habe mich gewundert, ob Sie vielleicht dazu noch was erläutern könnten oder würden, was genau für eine Transformation das war, wie Sie sagen würden. Und maybe also another question to Einav also about these wonderful examples you presented to us. And I was wondering when you presented Simple Action by Yasmin Goddard to us, if I understood that correctly, that the audience was involved. So people from the audience were taken in there. And I was wondering, as these might have been very intense experiences for the audiences, if you know anything about their reactions or if they had emotional struggles being part of the performance suddenly in such a intense way. So yeah, I'm coming back to the concrete experiences was my first question. Who wants to start?
Or I know, I don't know, or I can start.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how to describe it or say that my experience was a sort of the general experience of the audience. There was an after performance talk and I just felt like looking at it because there was so much repetition. You felt a sort of bored, yet this kind of not being able to decipher, ja, also diese Art, das eigentlich nicht fassen zu können und sofort interpretieren zu können, was man da, weil es einfach so eine Endlosschleife war, die man gesehen hat. Teilweise war die Bühne auch sehr, sehr dunkel. Es war sehr schwierig, das hat man ja im Video gesehen, überhaupt was wahrzunehmen. Und dann habe ich so gedacht, ja mein Gott, ne, was ist denn da jetzt eigentlich passiert? Und dann, als ich aber aufstand und rausging, habe ich gemerkt, ich fühle mich ganz anders als in dem Moment, in dem ich ins Theater reinging. Also für mich war es eher ein positives Gefühl, aber da war dann ein junger Mann in dieser After-Performance-Talk, der hat gesagt, ich habe noch nie so viel Angst erfahren. Also ich denke, dass das vielleicht von Zuschauer zu Zuschauer sehr verschieden war, aber worauf es mir in meinem Vortrag ankam, war eben diese Verschiebung weg von diesem Tanz als ein lesbares Stück, das offensichtlich beiden Choreografen wichtig ist, hin zu dieses, ich verändere diese innere Empfindsamkeit und dieser Zustand in einem bestimmten Level der Achtsamkeit in meinem Zuschauer. Also das scheint ja das zu sein, was die Choreografen als Intention haben. Wie stark das dann im Einzelfall funktioniert, sei dann auch wieder dahingestellt. Also nur so.
Gerne, Katja, Vaghi, direkt dazu wahrscheinlich.
Ich frage mich, weil du hast jetzt gesprochen von Schreiben und ich habe mir gedacht, ist das vielleicht nicht ein Schreiben von Energien, von Intensitäten? Sorry, das ist jetzt...
Nee, es ist ja eigentlich eine gute Frage. Nee, was ich ja problematisch immer finde, ist, dass wir ja im Tanz so eine Art Vorsprachlichkeit, also dass da so eine, in der Art, wie man Tanz anschaut, das ist ja nicht so was für mich so funktioniert, wie wenn ich ein Buch lese. Funktioniert für mich körperlich, kognitiv anders. Und ich finde, dass da sowas, diese Art der Vorsprachlichkeit, die Empfindung und auch die Ausführung und die Anschauung ausmacht, dass die sich fundamental von Text unterscheidet. Was jetzt aber nicht nehmen, was eine Wertigkeit sein sollte, sondern dass für mich sowas in der rein kinästhetischen, die natürlich auch kognitiv beeinflusst ist, Erfahrung, funktioniert das einfach für mich körperlich, intellektuell anders, als irgendwie mit dem Text umzugehen. Ja.
Shall I answer the question you asked about the experience of others? I think that the variations of possible experiences are as many as audience members. That's part of it. And I talked with Yasmin Bader about it, because also in the performance that I came to, one of the audience member who was older, and he used like a stick, and people have their own relationship towards their body. There are different body types and so on. So this audience member chose to go from the performance in the moment that he saw it started. And the other people, I mean, there were people also with different disabilities and different body types and so on, and they took part in it. So it's also touches, I'm sure, personal relationship to the feeling of being touched. This is what it plays on. But it's also a proposition, because you're able to say no, and that's okay. And in a certain time, you're not being watched anymore, because everybody, it's like one after the other at the same time, and everybody are taking part with this experience. Of course, it has this kind of momentum and the rhythm and the build-up of the experience. And first they are doing it with dancers, and then they approaching someone, and then it's like there's a build-up to do these kind of things. There's a dramaturgy of how you create a participatory performance. And that's okay to refuse, that's okay to go. And I think that it makes me also think in terms of solidarity, because I think that it also lies underneath your question, that we cannot always fulfill the expectations and the participations of everyone. That even this kind of aesthetic environments that create this kind of cultural code of how we behave in this environment, aesthetic code of how we behave in this environment, even in this kind of environment, you see the exception, that there's always someone who's missing this code. And it creates some kind of a tension that also plays on the aesthetic level, I guess. I mean, all the experiences in the room become part of the multiplying understanding of social environments.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. Before I continue maybe asking, I also would strongly support the discussion between you, not only the communicative act of dancing, which I liked very much, the phrasing of Einav, you quoted Katja. It's also maybe the communication between the three of you here I would like to support, but we already have a question by Eva Schürmann from the audience. So please, Eva Schürmann.
Yeah, thank you. I might even have a question that aims at the three of you, oder that may be a common point in all of your talks. Aber ich glaube, da Sie alle so glänzend im Deutschen sind, kann ich das auch auf Deutsch machen. Das ist nämlich so schon schwierig genug. Also ich war zunächst bei Ihrem Vortrag, Renate, da so total überrascht, dass Sie erwähnten, es hätte so ein Textparadigma in der Tanzwissenschaft gegeben, wo man Tanz als Text gelesen und verstanden hätte. Das finde ich total kontraintuitiv, weil es ja eben diese starke performative, nichtsprachliche, vorsprachliche, außersprachliche Dimension gibt. Und dann hatten Sie, ich weiß nicht mehr welche Choreografin, glaube ich, zitiert, die aber gleichwohl von Écriture-Choreographie spricht. Ne? Und da fiel mir auf, was mir dann auch bei Ihrem Vortrag Katja irgendwie wieder, was ich mir auch da mitgeschrieben habe, liegt nicht eine grundsätzliche Schwierigkeit des theoretischen Nachdenkens über Tanz darin, dass wir immer so ein Shift der Ebenen machen, indem das Deiktische des Tanzes translated into words, haben Sie nämlich gesagt, ne, erstmal übersetzt werden muss, damit wir darüber reden, was wir gesehen haben und was die performativen Künstler gezeigt haben. Ja? Und sind wir damit mitten in einem Gap zwischen so einer produktionsästhetischen Perspektive oder auch einer vollzugsästhetischen Perspektive, ja, wo wir etwas gesehen haben, was vom Vollzug lebt, was im Raum und Zeit sich realisiert, aber jetzt reden müssen über unsere Erfahrung dessen und das ist dann schon wieder was ganz anderes. Ne? Und dieser Gap, so in diesen Gap fallen wir aber gewissermaßen hier rein, also das ist schwierig, den zu überbrücken. Ja? Und Sie, Einav, bei Ihrem Vortrag, Einav, war mir aufgefallen, Sie hatten ja jemanden zitiert, der sagt, Touching ist so viel mehr ein Sinn der Nähe als alle anderen Sinne. Nicht? Sehen ist ein Distanzsinn und deswegen wurde das epistemisch privilegiert sozusagen. Wir trauen dem Sehen mehr Erkenntniskraft zu als dem Fühlen, aber Fühlen ist eben gerade nicht nur Sensation, sondern auch Affekt. Ne? Und das, finde ich, liegt so ähnlich wie das Deiktische bei dem, was Katja gesagt hat. Da zeigt sich was aber, wenn wir darüber reden wollen, ist dann diskursivieren müssen, übersetzen müssen und dann reden wir eben nicht mehr über dasselbe, sondern über irgendwas anderes. Ja? Und diese Schwierigkeiten schienen mir bei Ihnen allen dreien so Dreh- und Angelpunkte, aber eben eines Problems des Nachdenkens über Tanz zu sein.
Ja, also darf ich anfangen? Ja, das haben Sie ganz richtig erfasst. Ja, und es ist wirklich erstaunlich. Ich habe das auch, glaube ich, kurz erwähnt, dass die Tanzwissenschaft halt versucht hat, sich als akademische Disziplin zu etablieren und dann auf diesen Textual Turn aufgesprungen ist. Und es gibt also endless Dances, Text, Moving Words, Writing Dancing, Reading Dancing und so. Also gibt es eine endlose Reihe von Publikationen, die es zu diesem Thema gibt. Und was mir aber auch wichtig ist, was auch Teil des Problems ist, jenseits des Begriffes und jenseits von Repräsentation zu arbeiten, weil wir ja immer im sprachlichen, philosophischen Diskurs von so einer Begriffsbildung, die über Repräsentation funktioniert, ausgehen. Jetzt, wenn wir diese Repräsentation eigentlich nicht mehr haben, sondern vorbegrifflich arbeiten und dann aber wieder in Begriffe zurück übersetzen müssen, dann entsteht das, was Sie wirklich gut angesprochen haben, dieses Gap oder diese Art von Fehlen einer spezifischen diskursiven Struktur. Ja.
I think that I just don't understand it as a gap. I understand it also as different. There's always gap. There is always gap between my experience and your experience and Katja's experience and so on. There's also gap in understanding words because we have different kinds of personal denotation of words. And this is part of it. It's to understand that what we can do is only to unfold more and more and more layers of experience. And but it's not about to understand things as the same of their kind. It's to understand things as connected. And I think that when you talk about language as embodied, so you understand that the development of cognition is dependent on physicality, of being within the world, of taking part in existence. And the way that we understand goes throughout the senses and how we form and so on. I think that when I talk about touch, I talked about certain types of accessibility that the other senses don't allow. And this accessibility is really being in closeness with phenomenon, really to be ready at hand in the Heideggerian terms, but really being in closeness with phenomenon and to comprehend, but this is also goes through cognition and through understanding and through cultural education and so on, but to comprehend from the touch the traces of history within the phenomenon, everything that it unfolds. And it's the same also with language. I really like, in terms of how language is embodied, Lakoff and Johnson contribution to it in Philosophy in the Flesh, and Metaphors We Live By, that also there they are showing how our concepts are already physically danced from the physical existence. So there's no, I think that there's never this kind of it will never be about anything. I will give this lecture in another context, in another time. It will be a different lecture and presentation. There will never be like a fit. There's always interpretations, but within this interpretation, there's a connection. Even if the connection is because it's my own being, like I have a continuous human experience and I regulate all these connections.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Yeah, so you would say, let's embrace the gap.
Yeah,
and,
completely.
And to this idea of getting the point rightly, and so on, and saying yes to differences and to an endless process of iterative interpretations and so on.
Yeah. Completely. Absolutely.
There is also maybe if we look at how dancer and choreographer work, sometimes there is not much happening at the vocalized. I mean, no, vocalized maybe like but it's more not. I don't know if it's rational, but they are able to speak or to make themselves understood without speaking. And to enter in a sort of, I don't know.
Yeah, it's part of it, but also in one of my recent publications where I spoke to a choreographer and ballet master, she said she cannot really rehearse without using words. Some things remain unclear. And I think, yes, I totally agree with your approach, Einav, but at the same time, I feel like one of my favorite pastimes is to go into meta-discursive level. And then of all those approaches, and also Lakoff and Johnson, you can discuss whether you agree with it or not. I find it, for me, it's important to bring out where the different approaches come from. And for me, there's still something that isn't quite acknowledged about what dance can do in a sort of, let's say, in theoretical frameworks. So yeah, in the dance studio or in performance, I completely agree. But if I look on the writing about dance, I feel there's still stuff for me missing.
Do we need to write about dance? That's the point.
No,
I mean, to theorize, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Is that the right medium? And I think, I mean, that's often discussed in dance research, at least in the Anglo-American tradition. And also maybe to add, in the Anglo-American tradition, there is dance comes from PE, from sports, rather than in Germany where it's associated to theater. So that might explain why their need to go back to text.
I think German expressive dance has close links to the gymnast movement.
I'm talking about theory.
Also in theory.
Tanzwissenschaft,
also in theory, I mean, there's more the gap through the historical development, but there isn't a split in early German expressive dance. There are close links to gymnastics. And I think, we can always...
Ja, aber also die Tanzwissenschaft ist immer unter Theaterwissenschaft. Und in England und Amerika hat man versucht, wegzukommen von Theater, weil eben diesen Text nicht gibt. Und man wollte diesen Körper mehr im Vordergrund nehmen.
Da muss ich widersprechen. Also teilweise ist es halt auch, dass man Dance Departments wie zum Beispiel in Madison, Wisconsin eben aus pragmatischen Gründen auch an PA Departments angeschlossen hat, weil es halt um Finanzen ging und so weiter. Und in Deutschland haben wir eine viel längere Tradition von Theaterwissenschaften, die in die 20er Jahre noch früher zurückgehen. Also das sind so Universitätspolitiken. Aber klar können wir jetzt, also ich meine, das ist auch ein bisschen obsolet, klar können wir jetzt sagen, okay, der Tanz braucht keine Theorie, wir sind alle im Studio, das ist ja auch wunderbar.
Das ist nicht der Punkt. Aber
Darf ich vielleicht kurz einhaken, weil wir haben noch eine weitere Meldung, falls es von Frau Grob aus dem Publikum. Würden Sie sich zuschalten? Ja.
Yeah, hello. Hi. I how to start. I actually got quite interested when you used the word gap. And I think the gap is actually very essential. I mean, you can say it, you can use the word gap, or you can also just use the word silence, because in my opinion, that's when everything starts to open up. I would say that's exactly what it needs for an individual to become a practitioner in the aesthetic situation that is unfolding. I know also that you have been moving on in the discussion already, but I just thought that it was a lot, because I feel often that in that theoretical level, or once we start theorizing a lot, especially in dance, when I would say the embodiment, the movement of the heart, the organs, the flesh, the gravity, the earth, all of these components that are part for this moment to unfold seem to get a bit lost. And in this, I think it's probably, and I think, does dance need more theory or not? Maybe the other world, the less academic world, needs more movement, needs more embracing of the physicality of our body that's been given to us, because it allows for us to be present in life, yeah. So I don't know if that is of value to you, but
Yeah,
I completely agree. I further would say that also comprehending the gap is where empathy begins, because definition of Edith Stein to empathy, and the way she describes it as a Mitgefühl. It's not about entering the shoes. She's talking about entering the shoes of the other. But entering the shoes of the other is to understand that these are another shoes. It's not entering the shoes of yourself. It's not being in your own perspective. It's putting yourself in another perspective. And this is also Sean Gallagher, for example, when he deals with empathy, and he talks about there's all these aspects of mirror neurons and how we understand on the embodied level and so on. Because the mirror neurons is the fact that you can see activity in the neurons. When you see activity of someone else, there's an activity in your own neurons of action. So it demonstrates that it already happens on embodied level. However, when they deal with empathy, when Sean Gallagher, for example, deals with empathy, I mean, there is arguments also in these fields. He talks about its development later on in life, like in the age of 2 or so on, when the child is already able to narrate the point of view of another, to understand that the other has other intentionality. And this is very much important, because I think that also about the question also between theory and practice. You know, I'm embodied researcher. I'm interdisciplinary, I'm multicultural, I interact between body, philosophy, dance, and media body, like the technology body, between languages, between cultures, and so on. I'm working on the interactions. I'm also working with all my capacities as a human being, as I understand them. Not everything, but yeah, whatever I do. But I think that the work starts once you understand the gap. Once you understand that you have to listen to the information that you are not perceiving immediately. And this also goes back to perception, because we have habits of perception. We have also intentionality. That's the pragmatist part of me. Dewey, in How We Think, talks about, for example, about that we are thinking in relation to goal, and then in relation to goal, we also have our habits of deduction and induction. Yet we have our methodologies of how we digest information, and we have also habits of awareness of which kind of information we relate in the room. And everybody have it. And I think that when we start to be aware of it, to the fact that there might be another intentionality that there might be another information that others are picking out, and it's important to them for their intentionality, and there are different methodologies of thinking, we are not entering into a war of this methodology is better than other methodology. It's contextual, it's within a context. So this is also why I think that awareness to the gap is matters. Yeah.
Gibt es noch andere Anmerkungen von Ihnen dazu oder weitere Meldungen aus dem Publikum? Es gab ja auch noch einen Kommentar von Samantha Grob, jetzt ist sie schon wieder verschwunden, dass sie sie schrieb, diese Reflexion von Ihnen, Einav, über Touch wäre sehr interessant. Sie sehen es wahrscheinlich ja im Chat hier, ob Sie ein paar Bücher empfehlen könnten. Das wäre, glaube ich, auch etwas, was man gut im Forum machen könnte. Ich weiß nicht, ob Sie damit schon vertraut sind. Es gibt, there's a section that is called Forum, when you go to the Kongresszugang, where you entered on the platform, and there has each panel its own section, and you can write in their comments. So if you would like to share some books and give some recommendations, you of course can do this here, or you also could write them in the forum. And yeah. So if we don't have a current other questions, and
maybe I wanted to add something
yes,
very quickly,
please.
very briefly. Yeah, Einav talked about touch as a sense, and my perception is the relation to gravity, which is also a sense, and that we always take for granted that there are actually only two people in the world that have a mistat, and that cause a serious dysfunction in their everyday life. Is that something that we really, really take for granted, or knowing where up and down is?
So I understand this as a comment or as a contribution to the discussion.
Yeah, it's part of relationality as well, right? I mean, proprioception is in relation to gravity. It's relation to the context we are within. And also touch is a relational sense. We are always touching and being touched at the same time. So this is part, we are talking about aesthetic und Erkenntnis. So this is part of Erkenntnis. The fact that when we know ourselves, we are already know ourselves in a relationship. So this is where intersubjectivity starts.
And Eva Schürmann, please, yes.
Yeah, but since you mentioned Merleau-Ponty as a reference author of your considerations, I was thinking that he just point or aims at egalizing, so to speak, the differences between the senses, because he thinks of visual perceptions as being touched as well. Berührtes Berühren, I think, is here. Also, I don't know in the original what it is, but aber auf jeden Fall denkt er vom Denken als berührendes Berühren, berührt werden. Ja. Und das heißt, er würde da gerade bestimmte, oder seine Philosophie der Wahrnehmung ist so weit sozusagen, dass die modalen Differenzen im Grunde genommen immer auf den Punkt hinauslaufen, dass wir aber als Verkörperte in der Welt mit allen Sinnen immer uns zugleich mitten in dem befinden, was wir wahrnehmen. Und dass deswegen die Differenz, also dass er würde, glaube ich, nicht so eine starke Differenz machen zwischen Distanzsinn und Closeness of Touch.
Yeah.
I think so. I'm not sure.
Ja, also das stimmt schon total, was Sie über Merleau-Ponty sagen. Die Frage ist halt, wenn Merleau-Ponty auch ganz viel in der Tanzwissenschaft verwendet worden ist, Merleau-Ponty spricht aber eigentlich nie oder ganz, ganz selten über aufführungskünstlerische Praxiskontexte. Und deshalb ist es ein bisschen schwierig, weil diese Art, wenn wir im Studio sind und wenn wir tanzen, sind wir ja, das ist jetzt eine gefährliche Metapher, was ich benutze, aber ich bin mir dessen bewusst, sind wir ja nicht in diesem Zustand des alltäglichen Lebens, den Merleau-Ponty beschreibt. Womit ich meine, jetzt nicht, dass im Tanzstudio sein nicht für uns Teil, die wir alle getanzt haben, jetzt auf dem Panel, würde ich mal sagen, Teil unseres alltäglichen Lebens ist, aber es ist nochmal was anderes, wenn ich im Tanzstudio mich auseinandersetze mit bestimmten Bewegungsfindungen oder wenn ich einfach die Straße runtergehe und jetzt erstmal gar nicht bewusst drüber nachdenke, wie ich mich bewege. Ne? Und das ist so ein bisschen das Problem Merleau-Ponty, ja, in den Kontexten, die wir ansprechen, verwenden. Also so ein bisschen Stolperstein.
Ja, verstehe ich. Also Sie finden ihn da nicht unbedingt applikabel immer auf die Tanzpraxis.
We don't hear you, Ania.
Ja, I just noticed, sorry. Ja, ich danke Ihnen allen ganz herzlich für Ihren Versuch, um die Sprache zu ringen, das Übersetzen des Unübersetzbaren oder schwer Übersetzbaren, worin auch gerade die Herausforderung liegen kann oder auch eine Bereicherung in diesem Ringen. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich dafür. Ich beende jetzt hiermit das Panel. Es geht gleich weiter mit den nächsten Veranstaltungen. Das Panel wurde ja aufgezeichnet und soll dann ab August online stehen. Das heißt, Sie können dann auch den Link natürlich gerne rumschicken. Vielen herzlichen Dank für Ihre Vorträge, für sehr inspirierende Vorträge und für Ihre Fragen und ich wünsche Ihnen weiter einen schönen Kongress.